Hello, welcome to this first class, one of 10 of the Sons of Issachar. We're looking at historical cycles, and as we get going, it makes sense to lay things out. So once I can get the proper tab here, there we go. We'll do just that. So I want to lay out the course here as we're setting out for the next couple months, and then lay out how we're going to break down the classes, and we'll go from there into our proper topic today, trying to get our minds and our hands around what is time, what is memory, what is history. And once we have those three bases covered, then we can start looking at the different ways history has been approached and written down and contemplated over time. So first, the title of this course, The Sons of Issachar, is a reference to one of the books of Kings, where it mentions that one of the tribes, one of the clans, the sons of Issachar knew the times. They knew the times. And so I thought that was an appropriate title for this course. And the subtitle, because this is a college class, we must have a colon and a subtitle, like every good academic book. And so we are indeed looking at historical cycles and world orders. And there's much to get into on these fronts. The image of this poster that we have is a medieval image, and it's of the Wheel of Fortune. Nowadays, when we say the Wheel of Fortune, we tend to assume this is a television show from these United States, and so it is. But the television show is named after this medieval concept of the Wheel of Fortune, and it's a very simple concept. I think we can even observe it in life. People go through times of prosperity and privation and middling times as soon as anything. And this image you'll see when it comes to actually publications of Boethius's book, The Consolation of Philosophy. Now, I mentioned Boethius for a specific reason, but we'll get to that down the line. What's interesting about this course, and I think it's interesting about this image that we have of the Wheel of Fortune, is that I use the language that this is a medieval image. And for Joe Blow on the street, so it is. However, if you and I were to go back to the 8th or 9th or 10th centuries, which we call medieval, what's interesting, we're talking about historical cycles, and when do we say that cycles begin and epochs begin and world orders and civilizations, when do they begin and end? Okay, so we say this is a medieval image, and yet if we were to indeed go back to the 9th or 10th century, medieval man in Western Europe would not consider himself medieval. He would consider himself, much like the Byzantine Romans at the same time, to be 100% in the line of Rome. He would not use the language of ancient Rome, but we would. And this is the interesting thing about these delineations, is that they are fungible and they're very much predicated on different time periods. And we can get into all this. When do we say the ancient world ends and the medieval begins and so forth? But I think this is a very ripe image, the Wheel of Fortune, on this point, because it lays out, yes, the cyclical nature of individuals and community life, but also, taking a step back from the image itself, it also brings up the question of when do we say that time periods begin, and how valid are those? Now, I mentioned Boethius, and at the beginning of this class, for who's enrolled, and we still will accept tardy enrollments. There's nothing wrong with hopping on the train as it's pulling out of the station after all. But for who's enrolled, certainly we invite you to join our open events for this semester. For anyone who's enrolled in any classes whatsoever, including our collaboration classes, all of these open events are altogether free. If you're not enrolled, there's a slight fee just to help keep the internet going and the lights on. But in any case, we have plenty of things. We just wrapped up, as we're coming to the end of October, we just wrapped up our horror and uncanny series with Psycho last week, which was fun. And a little bit anxious, I suppose, with the book. And now, very appropriate to this class, just this very evening on the 28th of October, we're looking at medieval beginnings. So next week in this class, we're going to look at St. Augustine's City of God head on. But if anyone wants a teaser, we'll be getting into that this evening at 4:30 p.m. Pacific time, the City of God, 7:30 Eastern. And then once this wraps up, after looking at the Consolation of Philosophy, the Quran, as well as the Song of Roland, who gets to say when the medieval world begins? That's the purpose of that series. Then we conclude this semester with a bunch of weeks looking at different books in dialogue or in conflict with each other. So you can check that out, everyone, on our open events tab. And I mentioned Boethius earlier because one of the contenders for when the medieval age begins is Boethius, who certainly himself considered his days to be those of Romulus and Remus, though we consider them to be medieval. Okay, so there we go for the basic layout of the course. A little plug, as we must all have. And now to break out the classes ahead of us. So after we attempt to answer these very abstract concepts, what is time, what is memory, what is history, we're going to get into perennialist and Abrahamic conceptions of time. That's primarily what we're looking at today. And I think we have a full plate with all of these topics. Then next week, we will get into St. Augustine's City of God, a man, perhaps a contender for being the last ancient, the first medieval man, a man who certainly had a foot in both worlds. I think that's very obvious from his own life. He literally dies as the barbarians are besieging his city in North Africa, his Roman city in North Africa. Class 3, we're going to get into the Islamic scholar and judge, the Hadi, Ibn Khaldun. And Ibn Khaldun is one of probably a dozen or 24 people we can call the father of history. And we're going to get into his Muqaddimah, which is a medieval text and also a very modern text in the sense that Ibn Khaldun is the first sociologist, so to speak, as he lays out different questions, why the Islamic Caliphate was so successful, why the Berbers were in the position they were in North Africa, and so forth in his day. Then we're going to get into the medieval period, even we could argue the early modern period, with Giambattista Vico and his new science, and looking at history in this much more analytical, modern idea. After that, we're going to hop across the Atlantic into the New World and get into a new man, new American type of person called Samuel Benner. We're going to look at the Benner prophecies. Samuel Benner, like a good American, was interested in making money. And so he laid out economical and crop charts, and interestingly has been able to predict hundreds of years beforehand different things like the Great Depression or, I suppose the Great Depression of 1929 and the Great Depression of 2008, although they don't call it that. That's the Benner prophecies. We'll get to Oswald Spengler and his Decline of the West. kind of had a renaissance in the past couple of years. We're going to put on our globalist hats, I suppose, and look at Arnold Toynbee's study of history. He was hired by what we call the CFR, what was called in his day Chatham House, to produce what worked out to be dozens of volumes, which are condensed nowadays into two summary volumes. I don't even know if you can get the full study of history in its like 23 volume original, but you can certainly get a very helpful condensation of those works, and that's what we'll use. Then, speaking of revivals and renaissances, right before Christmas, a turning of the years, we'll have a look at Howe and Strauss's fourth turning. This probably more than any other author, except perhaps St. Augustine. This book has stayed in the popular consciousness, the fourth turning, and has indeed received a lot of attention lately, and a lot of updates, in fact, by one of the authors. I forget which one of them has passed on, but the other has done a few sequels, including very appropriate to our time together, looking at historical cycles. One of the sequels to the fourth turning is The Fourth Turning is Now. And this is a real juicy concept, and this class is definitely one of the high points of the course. Then we're going to have some eggnog and some, I don't know, what do you do during Christmas? So gingerbread houses and whatever. And then we'll come back in the new year, and we'll look at Changing World Orders, a modern text on this topic. And then we'll wind down the class looking at secular cycles. Of course, secular is a word which, when it's used in its classical and even academic usage, has a different meaning than simply religionless. Secular, secula, comes from Latin, and it means an age. It doesn't really have any religious or philosophical connotation like it does in modern English. But secular cycles, literally the cycles of ages. All right, and there's some bastard who's teaching the class and whatever. Anyway, the good stuff is up top here. And with that, we're going to jump into the beginning of this study. So what is time? What is memory? What is history? We must cover these points before we get into the idea of chronology and of historiography. Historiography, I think we know chronology. Chronology is the order of events in time. Chronos is the old god of time in the classical world, the symbol of time, if you like. History, I suppose, can be synonymous with that. But what on earth is historiography? Historiography, which I still have trouble spelling, is the study not of the past. Historiography is the study of the way the past has been written. So, for instance, I brought up a historiographical topic earlier in this class. I mentioned that this image of the Wheel of Fortune is something we call medieval, but the artist would not have that language to describe his time. Strictly speaking, he would be modern in the moment, although he probably would not have that time either. He would not have that language. But that, for instance, is a historiographical topic, meaning it's looking at the way the past has been presented, especially in the case of demarcation of time periods, right? So that's the stuff that historiography is interested in. And then getting deeper, why do we say, for instance, to use a very basic example, why do we say history is broken up into the ancient, the medieval, and the modern? And then the historiographer would be led to look, where does that language come from? Ah, it comes from the time of liberalism, capital L, Enlightenment, liberalism. And so all of a sudden, and we can revisit this topic in more depth, but all of a sudden, this question of why do we have these three delineations, at least up until the high school or college level, that we're all basically taught of ancient, medieval, and modern, all of a sudden, once we discover that it's the Enlightenment thinkers who come up with this breakdown, okay, now all of a sudden we're coming across philosophy. And once you get beyond just the superficial presentation of events in the past as history, you come across the idea of history being very philosophical. And that brings us right, like a plug in the wall, right into this topic here, historical cycles and world orders. We are fundamentally, if you look at these, we're looking at philosophers. All of these dudes are philosophers from various traditions. You only need to scratch the surface of history, except that you're bumping up against philosophy and spirituality. So there we go. And now we can ask this question: what is time? A simple explanation. This was one of the assigned readings. Actually, I think this was the only assigned reading for this first class. And as we're getting into this semester, I will recap or give a preview of coming attractions for each course, so for each session. So before we knock off, I will touch on St. Augustine and the readings there, and then the following class we'll really do a deep dive. So that's the way we're going to go here. But what is time? I remember when I was in, I very distinctly remember this, when I was in high school on the school bus, which just spit out the kids down the road as well. Just a few minutes ago, in fact, the high schoolers now were released from the same school bus, or at least the same route. And I distinctly remember hearing, I think it's a Pink Floyd song, with one of the lines being, time is slipping into the future, slipping into the future. And I remember at 13 or 14 years of age being very piqued, P-I-Q-U-E-D, piqued, or even disturbed by this idea, which was thrown in my lap, like many interesting ideas are when you're that age. Time is slipping into the future. And we have a consciousness of the past. We have a lot of interest in the future, although very little actual material to go on. In fact, I would suggest one of the reasons some of the best and brightest minds in history have been interested in historical cycles, maybe for the same reason we are interested in this class, is because we don't know what's coming next. So we're looking for patterns. We're looking for patterns in the past. It's not so popular these days. Sayings come and go, but there was a few years ago a saying that the most reliable indicator of someone's behavior is their past behavior. There was some instantiation of that. Well, guess what? That's true for historical patterns and cycles, just like it is in the weather right now. So I remember being 13, 14 years of age and hearing this song, time is slipping into the future, right? So we have this consciousness. In terms of time, it's what we have the most of, the past. Now, how we put that together, we can chop that up going forward. Then we have this precise moment, maybe a moment that doesn't even exist, or if it does, it's there and it's gone, right? The present. And then we're constantly slipping into this future that we don't know. We can't quite put our finger on, try as we might. And I remember that song uh, definitely disturbed me. So, what is time? Time is the progression of events from the past to the present and into the future. It can only move forward because the universe's disorder or entropy never decreases. The human brain tracks time using memories. More memories make time seem slower. And this is interesting. One of the things young people report, so to speak, maybe it's not in scientific surveys, but in terms of pop culture, in terms of video topics and so forth, is feeling that time speeds up. And people have done a few analyses of this in terms of video essays and so forth, quite recently, within the past couple of months, because this is a phenomenon that we tend to associate with elderly people. And on this last point, the human brain tracks time using memories. More memories make time seem slower. And one of the theses, why do young people have the same, report the same time flying by, time speeding up phenomena that elderly people historically have demonstrated? And one of the thoughts on this is that we are so overstimulated with telephonic media, videos, and TikTok shorts and Facebook shorts, or whatever they call these things. We're so overstimulated with short-term memories, which are, all of a sort, let's say. None of them are particularly serious, that the brain doesn't uh, embed these. And so you can wake up at 25 or 30 or 35, and it seems that time is just decades have gone by, and you don't really remember much. I don't really remember much. And that is one of the ideas. The human brain tracks time using memories, more significant memories, right? My first love, my first marriage, my second marriage, my third marriage, my first child, whatever the case may be. All right, these stick in the mind, and more superficial things don't. Therefore, the perception changes. There are less data points of serious memory. That's a thought on the matter. Let's see if we can blow this up some. There we go. So I'm not going to read every word here by any means. Time is familiar to everyone. All right, it's the air that we breathe. We're all in time. You and I, we all look different 5 or 10 or 15 years ago. We all know it's there. Yet it's hard to define and understand. Science, philosophy, and religion, and the arts have different definitions of time. But the system of measuring it is relatively consistent. Clocks are based on seconds, minutes, and hours. Whilst the basis for these units has changed throughout history, they trace their roots back to ancient Sumeria. The modern international unit of time, the second, the handy second, is defined by the electronic transition, believe it or not, of the cesium atom. But none of that actually tells us what is time. So I'm getting back to this point. Again, this class is really a class, as we'll find out, about philosophy and spirituality, because different cultures and traditions, including the secular, have different ways of approaching time. It necessarily, the way you and I look at the world is necessarily going to affect the way we look at time. And the authors here say that the basis for these units has changed throughout history. So if you were a Greek in Athens, you might use Plato's idea of time, the Golden Age and the Silver Age and the Bronze Age, rippling out from the age of the gods, from the time before time, from this time of perfection. If you were a Roman, you would count your days from the founding of the city of Rome. Uh, so, for instance, we might say that Julius Caesar now lived in 63 BC, which itself is a philosophical and religious designation before Christ. And yet Julius Caesar lived in the year, 700 from the founding of Rome. They had a completely different orientation of time. Very often, dynasties are convenient ways of measuring time. Even in the days of liberal democracy, we still date things from the Reagan era or the Clinton era, or whatever the case may be. We still do this. We think we're so modern, don't we? We've moved beyond that, but we really haven't. During the French Revolution, they reset time from the tennis court oath, and so everything counted out from there. In fact, during the French Revolution, there was an attempt to have metric time, where you would have a 10-month year, 10 days in a week, I think 10 hours in a day, and so forth. So everything was broken up into tens, and so forth, and so forth. So there are different bases for the counting out from time. But what exactly is time? Now, this is a pretty materialistic article, nothing wrong with that, but duly noted. What is time exactly? Physicists define time as the progression of events from the past to the present into the future. Basically, if a system is unchanging, it is timeless. Time can be considered to be a fourth dimension of reality. So we know 3 dimensions. Time is a fourth dimension. Use it to describe events in a 3-dimensional space. It is not something we can see, touch, or taste, but we can measure its passage. So time is a 4th-dimensional creature, perhaps. I can't, I'm thinking of things I've done in the summer. You're thinking of things you've done in the past. We can't go back there. Even if we go through this 3-dimensional reality, I'm thinking of a pleasant evening on one of the lakes near here a few months ago, more pleasant weather-wise than it is today, I'll tell you. I can go back there right now, or at least in half an hour. I can go back to this lake. I can, in 3-dimensional reality, go back and plop my behind in a chair and sit exactly where I sat this summer. And yet, this 4th dimension of time cannot be recreated. So it's interesting to think about. We have a certain mastery, even a certain control over 3-dimensional reality, and yet we can't go back to that moment in time. We have the arrow of time. Don't overthink this. This is pretty simple. The past, now slipping into the future. The now is like the razor blade edge. Of course, interesting, and of course, some of the Greek mythology and other so-called pagan mythologies were very aware of this. We have the most knowledge, potentially, of the past. We are on the razor blade of the present. And of course, human nature being what human nature is, of course, it is the future, that which we have the least definite control over. That is the one that we intend to give the most attention to. Very interesting. Physics equations work equally well whether time is moving forward into the future or backward into the past. However, time in the natural world has one direction called the arrow of time. The question of why time is irreversible is one of the biggest unresolved questions in science. Now, getting back to some of the thinkers that we're going to be looking at, any number of these individuals coming from various traditions are going to explain why that is. These unresolved questions. And part of that is perhaps, arguably, I'm not arguing it, I'm just saying it's a possibility, perhaps, modern science, as we call it, which is stripped of spirit, stripped of often meaning, perhaps this is missing something that these previous and even contemporary scholars were able to appreciate. And that is indeed meaning or spirit or whatever language we can use. See, this gets very philosophical rather quickly. One of the explanations is that the natural world follows the laws of thermodynamics. The second law of which states that within an isolated system, the entropy of the system, the winding down of the system, so to speak, remains constant or increases. If the universe is considered to be an isolated system, its entropy can never decrease. In other words, the universe cannot return to exactly the same state in which it was at an earlier point. Time cannot move backwards. This first class is taking place at the end of October here in America. And just on a funny note, we have a short story by an American author, Stephen King, called The Langoliers. And one of the concepts that science fiction story deals with is that aspect of time being, or time travel, or going back in time, which we might have fun with in fiction, being impossible. And partially in the story, it has to do with entropy and the fact that you cannot move backwards in time, according to modern natural science. All right. So this article is from ThoughtCo. What is time? Now we move into, again, this was already read for this class. Now we move, and it's easily accessible for people wanting to join us. And we still accept late enrollments. By the way, the purpose of classes, you're going to hear teachers talk more and more about this as AI education's on the horizon. The purpose of schools and classes, before we hop into what is memory, is not just data, right? Everyone can access these articles and read them for themselves, or just watch this this first part of the session here. But that's not the purpose of a class or of a school. The real genius going forward into the age of AI education, so-called, the real purpose of schools is going to be human interactions. It's not pure data. People don't understand that. To be educated does not mean to know a lot of facts. You can go online all day. You can go to your library and get lots of facts. That does not make you educated. What makes one educated as a quality largely has to do with a certain spirit that is best inculcated in group learning. And with that plug being seen to, indeed, let's get into our next question. What is time? What is memory? How memories help us and why they sometimes fail. Now we're really getting deeper into what the historian does. Because, of course, what memories do we choose to keep? What memories have we innocently forgotten? And what memories, personally or socially, what memories have we chosen to forget? I just want to check the screen share and everything. Everything looks good. Okay. Sometimes things conk out. Okay. So our memory helps make us who we are. It allows us to function in our daily lives, forge relationships that are vital for our well-being, and remember important events from our past. But memory isn't perfect. Understanding what it is and how it works can offer insights into what we might be able to do to make ours stronger. Obviously, the focus of this is the individual's memory, but just like the Wheel of Fortune is true in our own lives, privately, personally, it's also true for this course for groups of people. We might remember the old alchemical maxim, as below, so above. If you know anything about Chinese medicine, you know that this is a principle. For instance, I always forget the name of this, but there's an aspect of Chinese medicine where the foot is a microcosm of our bodies. So one toe represents what I'm making this up here, but it represents your knee. One toe represents your head. The arch of your foot represents your guts. I think that is the case in this modality. Your shoulders are the pads of your toes, whatever. I forget the specifics. You'd not have me for a Chinese doctor, I suppose. But as above, so below, things are in microcosm. Here at Apocatastasis, in fact, we are very soon running a class on homeopathy that I'm not teaching, luckily. We actually have someone who knows about homeopathy teaching it here. It's, in fact, our October-November feature. And in homeopathy, that's one of the principles that, in fact, I worked at a bar for a long time. The drunks would have the maxim, hair of the dog that bit you. So if you have a hangover, one of the solutions to the hangover is to have a bit more alcohol, and that will ease the hangover. There's our instructor for that. But homeopathy, whether it's alcohol or poison ivy or anything else, one of the principles of homeopathy is that whatever caused you to be sick, if it's a chemical, that thing in dilution will help ease the symptoms of the overdose, so to speak. So anyway, the point is, as above, so below. Things that are true in miniature might as well be true in a larger case. And so when you're dealing with human beings, the Wheel of Fortune applies. Memory applies in our own lives. So does common memory. Back to our article here. Memory problems are often relatively minor annoyances like forgetting birthdays. However, they can also be a sign of serious conditions such as Alzheimer's and other kinds of dementia. These conditions affect the quality of life and the ability to function. So how memories are formed. I'm skipping around here. In order to create new memory, information must be changed into a usable form, which occurs through a process known as encoding. Once the information has been successfully encoded, it must be stored in the memory for later use. Researchers have long believed that memories form due to changes in brain neurons. Our understanding today is that memories are created through connections that exist between these neurons, either by strengthening these connections or through the growth of new connections. This is why reviewing and rehearsing information improves the ability to remember it. Practice strengthens connections between the synapses that store that memory. Much of our stored memory lies outside of our awareness most of the time, except when we actually need to use it. The memory retrieval process allows us to bring stored memories into conscious awareness. Now, getting back to this course. Now, this is an intimate or personal article about our own memories. But let's go back to these sentences. Much of our stored memory lies outside of our awareness most of the time, except when we actually need to use it. Does that remind you of anything in society? Okay, so that's true for me. In fact, recently, I was having a heck of a time remembering who was the head of the Army Air Corps during the Second World War. And I was going nuts over this because I read a whole book on this man. And uh, after about an hour, I refused to go to Google or whatever, or Bing. After an hour of stubborn chewing over it, I realized it was Curtis LeMay. Curtis LeMay was the head of what we now call the Army Air Force. I was not in the habit of thinking about that. I probably have not thought about Curtis LeMay for 10 or 15 years. And so it was a struggle. Much of our stored memory, we read, lies outside our awareness most of the time. That memory of Curtis LeMay was in my brain every single second since I read that book about him way back when. But it was outside of my awareness. Memory retrieval processes allow us to bring stored memories into conscious awareness. And I smile when I read these sentences because I ask the question, does this remind you of something in society? I was thinking libraries, right? So we all have our own memories that we either dredge up or let lie or dig up from time to time. Libraries are basically, as a community, where we do this, right? We put all of our memories, all of our stories in these places. I suppose the internet does the same function. And then we look it up, as we say. We look it up when we need it. Memory retrieval processes allow us to bring stored memories into conscious awareness. Some of these retrieval processes as a society would be education, formal education, religious ceremonies, coming of age ceremonies, civic holidays, national canon of literature. All of these are ways as a group of people that we routinely revive memories. Because if we don't, memories don't last long. Indeed, unfortunately, memories don't always last. We tend to forget a great deal of things we learn. Some memories are very brief, just seconds long. Such memories allow people to take in sensory information about the world. You might be on a roller coaster, or very often things that get your adrenaline pumping will stick in your memory. You might remember maybe a close call. I can think of in a snowstorm once losing control of a car on a roundabout. It was I can laugh about it now. It wasn't fun to laugh about in the moment as your car was careening towards a wall, and thanks be to God, it stopped short. And by a miracle, I was not run over by the semi trucks trying to get my car righted after the fact. But the point is, I can remember that night very, very much. I might not remember my breakfast. I can remember those few minutes. Short-term memories are a bit longer. They last about 20 to 30 seconds. These memories mostly consist of the information people are currently focusing on and thinking about. Some memories are capable of enduring much longer, days, weeks, months, even decades. Most of these long-term memories lie outside of immediate awareness. Why do you remember painful memories? Think about what makes the news today, last week, last month, last year. What makes the history books? Very often painful memories. Have we ever noticed that many times painful memories tend to hang on for long periods of time? Research suggests that this is because of increased biological arousal during the negative experience, which increases the longevity of the memory. I remember a vignette that's given about the president of Harvard. And the secretary, if memory serves, speaking of speaking of faulty memory, you'll have to take my word for it. I might change out the actors one way or another. but the point is going to remain. So anyway, we'll say the president of Harvard was in his office, and the secretary came in, and he was frazzled, and he announced that he had a very close run-in. He was riding his wagon to the office, and a deer, some sort of animal, a wolf, whatever. We used to have wolves in New England. An animal jumped out and spooked the horse, and the horse was frightened, and the driver, the secretary, lost control of the vehicle. And having composed the vehicle and composed himself and the horse, he carried on and announced to the president of Harvard, my goodness gracious, it's a miracle, it's a blessing, it's something else altogether that I survived. And the response from the president of Harvard was, yes, but how many times have you come along that path and nothing has happened, right? In other words, the painful memory, the anxious memory of the wagon nearly coming to catastrophe along with its driver, that stuck in his head. And yet the greater blessing of the hundreds or thousands of times the man was not spooked and the horse was not spooked, that didn't stick in his brain. Why? Because research suggests this is because of increased biological arousal during the negative experience. To use the information that has been encoded into memory, it first has to be retrieved. There are many factors that can influence this process, including the type of information being used and the retrieval cues that are present. Of course, this process is not always perfect. Have we ever felt like we had the answer to a question, like Curtis LeMay in World War II, just out of reach? This is an example of the tip of the tongue phenomena. All right. Then we have organizing memory. I'll just read a little bit here and then hop over to our final point before we take a little bit of a break. The ability to access and retrieve information from long-term memory allows us to use these memories to make decisions, interact with others, and solve problems. But in order to be retrievable, memories have to be organized in some way. Now, in just a little bit, I will be getting into this book. This is the real focus of, why is this not cooperating? I want to take over the screen like a good egomaniac. Oh my goodness. Okay, this is called The Landscape of History by John Gaddis. There we go. It only took half an hour, but there we go. The Landscape of History. And this is his bailiwick in this book. This is his study. What does the historian put down? And Gaddis, just as we have to do, Gaddis says that the historian is like a map maker. A map maker, to tease things out before we hit this book head on, a map maker, by definition, has to leave things out. He would be a cruddy map maker if he didn't. We're going to get to that. But that is the case with memory. We choose to remember certain things. We have to leave certain things out. And why do we do so? Will very largely be influenced by, there we go. Can we do this? You have all these options at the bottom, probably more options than you'd need. What we choose to leave in and leave out, getting to the point of historiography, very often will be influenced by our worldview and by our philosophy, our spiritual traditions, and so forth. Okay, so we've attempted to answer what is time, or at least to ask the question and think about it in the week ahead. We've attempted to answer and certainly ask the question, what is memory, personal and communal? And now we get into what is history. History is the study of people, actions, decisions, and interactions and behaviors. History is narrative. From chaos comes order. We seek to understand the past by determining and ordering facts. From these narratives, we hope to explain the decisions and processes which shape our existence. Perhaps we might even distill patterns and lessons to guide, but never to determine our responses to challenges faced today. Patterns, anyone? Sons of Issachar, right? Perhaps you might do that. What are you talking about? Of course we're going to do that. We're humans. We want to know what's coming up. Of course we're looking for patterns. History is the study of people, actions, decisions, interactions, and behaviors. It is so compelling a subject because it encapsulates themes which expose the human condition in all of its guises and that resonate throughout time. Themes such as power, weakness, corruption, tragedy, triumph. These are, to our point about as above, so below, right? These are personal interests as well as common interests. Let's look at that list again. Power, weakness, corruption, tragedy, and triumph. I can think of these things in my life, and so can you. We can also think about them to our historical focus in terms of groups of people. Nowhere are these themes clearer than in political history. Still the necessary core of the field and the most meaningful of the myriad of approaches to the study of history. All right, probably in all of our backgrounds, that's how we learned history, and probably not just political history, but great man history. So we looked at kings and inventors and generals in history. There are other ways to look at history. Might want to take a feminist look at history, or a Marxist or economical look at history, a spiritual look at history in the case of St. Augustine or Ibn Khaldun. We might want to take a microcosmic look at history in the study of one item. I met a man who was very hot for the study of a chair, believe it or not, up the hill in the next town over in Washington, Connecticut. Actually, about this time of year, it was at a haunted house event. I met a man at the library there, and he was an expert in a chair, a single chair that Abraham Lincoln sat in. And he could tell you everything there was about this one chair that Abraham Lincoln sat in one time on one train ride going from New York to Baltimore in 1861. And he could tell you the whole century and a half history of the chair. That's micro history. And we can go on and on. If you have great man history, you have so-called history from below or folk history and so many other tools. But nevertheless, as this article points out, most of our understanding of history is political or great man history. Yet it has fallen out of fashion and subsequently into disrepute, wrongly demonized as stale and irrelevant. The result has been to significantly erode the utility of ordering, explaining, and distilling lessons from the past. History's primary purpose is to stand at the center of diverse, tolerant, intellectually rigorous debate about our existence, our political systems, leadership, society, and economy and culture. However, open and free debate, as in so many areas of life, is too often lacking and is not difficult to locate the case of this intolerance. Okay. So to recap here, as we're going to take a little break and then come back for some class time chit-chat. I'm going to remove this and wait an hour to take over the screen. There we go. I can live with that. Okay. So to recap, we looked at what is time, what is memory, what is history, and then come where we're going with this. In John Lewis Gaddis's book, and I will also include a fourth link as to how to download the PDF of this, courtesy of Yandex, um, you get into the question, or the simile rather, of the historian as map maker, the cartographer. A map maker, as I said before, cannot include every single thing in the park. Just for fun, we're going to say that he's been hired to make a map of the state park. This would be like, there's actually a short story by Jonathan Swift from Gulliver's Travels. This is actually something that people have had fun with in the past, just like people have had jokes about memory and about Alzheimer's. Not people with Alzheimer's, but just the idea of losing memory. There's all sorts of one-liners about that. Likewise, people have had fun with this idea of a map maker, including every single twig and every single frog and drop of water and so forth and so forth. Because at the end of the day, if you did that, why would you be a bad cartographer? Because the purpose of a map is to distill things. If the map, like Jonathan Swift has, if the map was as big as the park, it would be absurd. So if the map was completely accurate to every rock and rill and cricket in the park, it would literally be 5 miles by 5 miles. It would defeat the purpose of a map. The purpose of a map is to include the basic points so that you can orient yourself through this three-dimensional reality called the park. And likewise with the historian cannot include everything. And so what he chooses to include or omit will be shaped, pursuant to this course, by his philosophy. And one other thing to set up for our second session here, or our second part of this session, is a recent article, like many good recent articles, published on Substack. And I can't stop talking about this article. It's entitled "The Dawn of the Post-Literate Age." The article we just looked at, What is History, lamented the decline of political history, which is not the same as great man history, but it's the type of political history most of us are familiar with from school. And the person wrote, I'll read again, "The result of not teaching political or great man history has been to significantly erode the utility of ordering, explaining, and distilling the lessons of the past." And this article that I just alluded to, The Dawn of the Post-Literate Society, brings up a similar reality, meaning you come from the medieval into the early modern period, let's say 1700s, an age of not reading, to where you have a majority of people not just reading, but addicted to reading. That continues to about the Second World War. And from the Second World War until now, and certainly in the last 30 years or so, the drop-off, the massive drop-off of reading habits. And this is getting back to historiographical realities. Time periods affect how we perceive history. The written word is logical. And this is what this Substack article, this will now be the fifth link down below in the description. You can access this Substack article. Reading, when you have a society for 300 years that is reading in a linear, logical fashion, this affects how we perceive time in an orderly way, right? A written text, a sentence, has to be laid out, especially in English, or at least this is a feature of English, because it has to be, the word order is very important in English as opposed to like Latin or something. So the logical nature of a society that is reading will influence the way they perceive time. Anyway, long story short, this Substack article kind of is jagging off of what this last article, What is History, is lamenting. With for the What is History article, with the drop off of political history And for the Substack article with the drop off of reading, our perception of time is now becoming less logical in our time period in the modern West. It's becoming less logical and rational. And we're actually sinking back into a more magical, illogical type of perception of reality that we would associate with the medieval period or with the ancient world. There's a lot to get into here. I'm going to knock off with the recording and then just check up on the participant here, and then we're going to take a break. So it's not too late to sign up for the class. Just write myself at the regular address, ApocatastasisInstitute at AOL. We'll get you set up there. The train hasn't quite left the station. And with that, I'm going to knock off with this section of the class, and we'll go from there.